For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Karen Velez. My husband and I own Wolf Creek Family Farm. This is this 40-acre market farm that you're at today. I am also the owner of Just Grow Something Garden Consulting and Education. I started gardening about 20 years ago. We have been gardening and market farming for 17 of those years. This is our 17th season doing that. So we started on a 5-acre homestead across the highway and then moved over here to the 40 acres about 10-ish, 12-ish years ago. I went back to school to get my degree in horticulture from Oregon State University, and ever since doing that, I have made it my mission to teach people how to grow their own food. That is my thing. There is power in food. That is my thing. I think everybody needs to know how to grow at least a little bit of something of their own, even if they don't plan on doing it all the time. It's something that's important to know. And yes, you're going to hear my chickens arguing out there. So that's why, I'm doing this series of workshops just to help home gardeners who either have no idea where to start or have started and need a little bit of help or instruction in trying to figure things out. This is the indoor seed starting workshop. I first tried starting my own seedlings indoors about 15 years ago when we really started to expand what we were doing, and I very quickly realized that I had a ton of plants that I needed to get out into the gardens, and it was going to be a whole lot cheaper for me to do those seeds indoors on my own versus trying to buy transplants. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people do this. It is, generally speaking, less expensive once you sort of get set up to do your own seeds indoors every single year versus having to go and buy them from the nursery. Some people don't want to mess with it, and that's perfectly fine. The other thing too is you can control the varieties. You get to choose what it is that you want to grow. When you go to the nursery, a lot of the time there's a kind of limited variety of things that you're going to get. You have certain types of tomatoes to choose from, certain types of, when there are hundreds and thousands of varieties of really cool things that you can grow that you are not going to find in the nursery or in the garden center. Heirloom varieties specifically are a big one. And so, if you can start your own, you get to start whatever you like. And you can do as many or as few of them as you want. You don't have to buy them in a 4-pack, you don't have to buy them in a big pot, you get to the flexibility. I was not successful my first time starting seeds indoors. I wasn't successful the second time. I wasn't very successful the third time. It took me probably 5 years to really kind of get a system down where I knew what to do every single time, how to do it. And there are still times when, something fails for one reason or another. It's a living organism, and, things can't be exactly the same every single time. And so sometimes there's going to be things that get messed up. So you're not failing, if something goes wrong, you're just still learning, and you're also kind of mercy at the conditions, of the plant and that sort of thing. So, I will say that there are certain things that you can control that are going to give you a much larger chance of success, and that's what we're going to focus on today. The first thing that we're going to talk about is your starting medium. So when you go into the nursery or the garden center, you're going to see seed starting mixes or seed starting blends or seed starting medium, whatever they call it. Those are generally not going to contain any type of an actual soil component. It's not going to have compost in it or garden soil or anything else, and there's a very good reason for that. They want that seed starting mix to be essentially inert, meaning there is nothing really living in it. This is going to prevent the possibility of a fungal disease already existing in that soil component that's going to attack your little seedlings right away. Now, there are other ways for you to bring that in even when using a seed starting mix, but this is one way to keep it to where they're not going to automatically have that to start with, so at least you're off to a better start. The second part of it is it usually contains vermiculite and or perlite and some other materials that are going to do two things. Retain the moisture as needed in order to make sure there's enough moisture in there to keep in contact with the seed coating so that it can germinate the way that it's supposed to, but also be well draining. So it sounds like, okay, we want water, but we don't want water. Yes, to both of those. You don't want too much water, but you want enough. And having those components actually makes it to where it is both retaining water and draining well enough to where you're not going to drown your little seedlings. So that is the recommendation for beginners when it comes to starting seed. And even professionals and, and experienced gardeners too will often use a seed starting mix. There are other things that you can use as well. This is a compressed block. This is a seed starter mix that is 100% coconut coir. And so I will show you here in a minute how this works, but essentially you just break it up and you throw it into a container and you water it and it expands. And it becomes the medium that you plant into. This is 100% coconut coir. There is nothing else in there. So it is very well draining. It also naturally does hold on to some moisture. These are coconut coir pellets. You can also find these in peat moss versions as well, although most manufacturers are trying to move further away from using peat because it's not really a sustainable resource. If you get the Canadian peat moss, it's a little bit better, but they've actually just banned the use of peat moss at all over in the UK, so because environmental concerns. So a lot of the companies are moving more towards coconut, the cocoa fiber, cocoa coir. But you water this and it turns into this. It just expands and pops up. And it's got a little net thing, and you literally, when you go to transplant, you pop this thing right into the ground with the seed. So you put the little seed in top and you keep it watered. With this, you're going to need to have it in some sort of a tray. You can put the water in the bottom of the tray. The problem with this and with the seed starting, the coconut coir itself like this is you do have to kind of pay attention to make sure that you're watering it enough once the seeds have sprouted. Usually the really good first watering is going to hold enough moisture for the seeds to sprout, but once it sprouts, you have to make sure that you're watching to make sure it's getting enough water. There are also other things like hemp. This is not something that I recommend for beginners. These are like hemp blocks. They're kind of intended to be similar to this, but in most instances, this is really designed more for like a hydroponic situation. And I mean, it looks very convenient. You just pop the little seed in there and you keep them watered. But in my experience, in order to keep it moist enough for the seeds to sprout and then also moist enough for the little seedlings, it gets too wet on the bottom and it dries out on the top. So something like this is not something that I would recommend for seed starting for beginners or even people who really know what they're doing, because I don't think they function very well. There is versions of this where it's just kind of the fiber, and you can see it's kind of, flaky like this. Again, not a good medium to use all on its own. So I would stick with this regular seed starting mix or these little, types of things. Now, what about potting soil? It is not recommended in the beginning for people to use potting soil, actual potting soil, as a seed starting mix because of that soil component. Number one, there's going to be some sort of compost or garden soil or something in that potting soil that could contain microbes or could contain fungal diseases that you could bring in and that will attack your seedlings. It's a slim chance because most of that stuff has been sort of sterilized before being put into the bag or whatever, but it is still a possibility. It's also more likely to attract fungal diseases. Secondly, it doesn't drain as well as we might want for our seeds to get started. It's intended for plants that are growing like this, that already have a root system of some sort that need extra moisture. But with your baby seedlings, sometimes it's too much. It can actually encourage root rot. Now, with that being said, I'm not always the rule follower. And for years, I have used a specific potting soil as my seed starting mix. But the reason that I do that is because I grow a lot of plants. And it didn't make any sense to me for me to have a separate seed starting mix and then also have a potting soil when I was doing all of this stuff at the same time. This year I changed that a little bit just because my normal standard potting soil wasn't really available to me, and I ended up buying potting soil in bulk, like by the cubic yard. And it was definitely not a texture that would be conducive to starting seeds. So that is one of the things that we're concerned about, is the texture. I'm going to show you So this is just sort of your standard potting soil that you can get, right? You can pass that down if you want. You can see it's very chunky. There is perlite or vermiculite mixed in there, but there's also, like, you know, kind of chunks of coconut fiber in there. That's not very fine. It's not real easy for a seed to be in contact with a moist soil for an extended period of time. So that's not something that's going to germinate, you know, seeds very quickly or very easily. The difference, though, is if you do choose to use a potting soil, if you were to choose something like this, well, now you can feel that texture is different. It's more fine. Yeah, you have a little bit of kind of chunky stuff in there, but nothing that you couldn't just pick out. The seed's going to have a better, you know, way to hold on to that moisture versus that first one that I passed around. So when you're just making a decision as to what you want to use to start your seeds in, thank you, that's the texture that you're looking for. You want something that is fine, that is also going to be well draining, but is also going to hold some of that moisture, because I can grab that and it sort of, you know, holds together on its own. Once you decide on a medium, the next thing you have to do is find something to put that medium in. So, containers. There are so many different things that you can use. You can reuse nursery containers that you've had from plants before. There's no problem with that. Just wash it with some hot soapy water at the end of the season, hang on to them for the next year, and use them that way. These are little peat pots that come in trays, just like you would see in the nursery, only they're not plastic. They're made of peat, which means they can be planted directly into the ground or transplanted up into a larger pot immediately. I always make sure to cut the bottoms of these before I do that to allow the roots to really start to move first, but these will biodegrade into the soil, and they're a great, you know, sort of alternative to using the plastic all the time.
Do you have to cut them if you bottom water too, or will it absorb through that?
It'll absorb through that, and you will less likely to need to cut the bottom of them before you transplant at that point, because that bottom watering is already going to start to soften that material up. And so you can just sort of press on the bottom of it. If you press on the bottom and it's very soft, it almost feels like you can kind of push your finger through, then you likely don't have to worry about cutting the bottom of them. Yeah, but when you're watering them, yeah, I would keep them intact. Otherwise, you're more likely to degrade the bottom of that more quickly. So just leave them intact. You know, same thing with these. These are seedling pots, also made out of that, you know, that peat moss. You can get ready-made little miniature, like, greenhouse type things. These are, I think these came off of Amazon. You've got, you know, your 12 little trays, little cells here that you can plant into. It's got something on the bottom, so you can bottom water, put the water in there, just put that little guy in there and let it soak up the water that way. It's got a little humidity dome, which we'll talk about here in a minute, the reason behind that. All kind of together in its own little container. But you do not have to go and buy things. You can use cottage cheese containers or yogurt containers. You can use little individual plastic cups. People use solo cups. What you're concerned about with your container is what volume of soil does it hold, and does it have drainage? So drainage is a big thing. We don't want our soils sitting in water and being waterlogged. We want it to be able to drain, but we do want it to be able to hold enough soil for whatever it is that we are growing. So something like this, or even that little one there, perfectly fine for things like lettuces, brassicas, cabbage, kale, broccoli, any of your leafy greens. You can easily start these in this and not have to transplant these up into a larger container before they go out in the ground. Those things go in the ground fairly early. Within a couple of weeks, they're ready to just pop out and throw into the ground. So that's something that's easy to do for just about any of the smaller things. For larger things like tomatoes, more than likely, if you're starting in these size containers, you are going to have to pot them up probably once into a larger container, probably something about this volume or so, depending on how early you start them. Unless you're transplanting them out when they're much smaller, you likely are going to want to pot them up once, which is fine. That's perfect. That's perfectly okay. The reason we start in smaller containers is mainly in order to be able to ensure that those seeds are in contact with the soil and that soil is staying wet the whole time that we're waiting for that seed to sprout. The seed coat needs to be broken down by that moisture. and it needs a certain amount of time in contact with that moisture in order to be able to sprout. So a seed is essentially just a baby plant inside a box with a sack lunch. It has everything that it needs to be able to pop out of that little box and be able to grow, which is another note about seed starting mixes. There are no nutrients in these. So once your seeds do sprout and they get to where they have their first 2 true leaves, you likely are going to have to feed them probably at least once before transplanting them outside. If they're growing in these things for longer than 4 weeks or so, you might have to feed them twice, especially if you pot them up. So that's something to keep in mind. Potting soil generally does already have some nutrients in it. So that might be another reason why you choose potting soil rather than a seed starting mix later on down the road. But it's really no big deal if you just use a little bit of liquid fertilizer of some sort, plant food, then you'll be just fine.
When you pot them up, do you keep them in the same soil for their seed starting mix?
Yes, you seed so when you're potting up with seed starting mix or whatever, you keep them in that same soil, but then you transplant them into something that is a potting soil at that point. There's no reason to keep it in just an inert seed starting mix at that point. So yeah, if you go ahead and pot them up into potting soil and then just feed them when you pot them up, then you won't need to do anything until you finally get them out of the ground. So there is a little bit of a caveat to that. If you do something like a Miracle-Gro potting mix that has probably some of those Miracle-Gros have a really high amount of nitrogen, and that can actually be a little bit detrimental to the seedlings when they're sprouting. So just look on the package. In most instances, like I said, if you're starting with a seed starting mix, you're not going to have to worry about it. But if you're choosing a potting soil, make sure you've got one that has a very low of those 3 numbers. You don't want a whole lot in there because you don't want to burn your seedlings, for sure. The other option, which is both a soil and a container, is seed blocking. So this is a seed blocker. These come in sizes ranging from a 1/2 inch, like 12 little 1/2 inch blocks, all the way up to 1 4-inch block, and everything in between like this. This is 4 1.5 inch blocks, I think. And the idea behind soil blocking is you create a seed starting mix of your own, or you purchase one, or you use a potting soil, and you wet that mix and you use this to create blocks. And there is no container that goes with it. This is what they look like once they are formed. An empty one. I don't even think I have an empty one. I had such good germination on all this. This is what they look like. It's just a block of soil. And you put them in a tray like this, and you pop your little seeds into the top, and the mix will be wet enough at that point that you won't have to water it again until after these sprout. The idea is these aren't going to come root bound. So if you can't get the plants into the ground fast enough, or you started them too early and the soil isn't ready, or the weather isn't ready, you know, a lot of the times in these plastic things, the roots are going to hit the edge of the plastic and they're going to start to wrap around themselves. We call that being root bound. Well, when you transplant those, you have to kind of like loosen up those roots and get those roots like primed to start growing again, and that causes a longer amount of transplant shock. You're always going to have some transplant shock, but that makes it a little bit worse. With these soil blocks, the roots are just going to kind of hang out. We call that air pruning. Once they get to the edge of the soil, they just sort of sit and they wait in sort of a holding pattern until they come in contact with more soil, either when you pot them up into something larger or you put them in the ground. And as soon as they come in contact with that soil, they're immediately off and running again. So if you really want to kind of get into, you know, seed starting and you don't want to have to worry about all the plastic and stuff, this is a really great way to go. I bought that soil blocker probably 12 years ago. Used it once, didn't use it right, decided I wasn't going to use it because I was in a hurry to get all my stuff done, and it literally sat in my old greenhouse for years until I picked it up again this year. And I'm kicking myself now for not having been using this thing the whole time. So I highly recommend soil blockers, and the fun thing about these too is if you really get into it, you can get smaller ones that start the seeds fairly small, and then each of these has this little divot in the center, this little dibbler that will make the hole in the top. Well, the larger ones of these have blockers that are large enough to fit the smallest block into. So you don't even have to pot up into plastic. You can pot up into another soil block, which is really fun. So that's just a sidebar. Okay, so we've talked seed starting.
They stay like that.
They do. So these, yeah, I mean, they're all close together, so they don't dry out very quickly. I like to put them in these trays like this so I can just pour the water and let it soak up from the bottom. The only downside to these is if you water too hard from the top, then obviously it's soil and it's going to start to fall apart. Or I did an interview probably a month or two ago on the podcast that I had a flower farmer who uses these exclusively for doing all her outdoor flowers, and she says she has been known to take these outside to harden the plants off to get them ready to go on the ground, and then left them out there and they had a rainstorm. So she came out to basically a tray full of these floating seedlings because all the soil was just kind of, so that's the only downside. There's nothing containing that soil. So if you water too hard, they might fall apart a little bit. But other than that, these have been great. And like I said, you've got all these roots going on, and they're just kind of hanging out. Nobody's wrapping themselves around it at this point. So
when you bottom water those, do you let them just sit in there for a certain amount of time? Or
yes.
do you just
Yeah, so I'll start along the edge here where there's no soil, because you can see I didn't fill it completely up. I've got this edge here, so it gives me a spot to be able to see how much water's going in. So I will pour in from here and just sort of lean it back and continue, and then let it come level until I see there's probably about a ½ inch of water in the bottom, and then I will let it sit. As long as it absorbs all that water after about 5 minutes or so, then we're good to go. If I put too much in there and it's not really absorbing at all, or I can see that they're sort of starting to get too much water in them and they might fall apart, that's when I just tip it and drain more of it out. So a little bit at a time is really what I try to do, and that seems to be the most effective. When you're starting the seeds, one of the things is we really want to make sure that top is moist. And so with these, if for some reason they were to dry out, I tend to use a spray bottle instead of pouring water over top, because I don't want to disturb the seeds. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the actual technique of planting the seeds. So a lot of people who have tried to do seed starting on their own will encounter a couple of problems, one of which is slow germination. If you look on the back of the seed pack and it says, it should germinate in 8 to 10 days or 5 to 7 days or whatever. And you plant your seeds and you set them on your table or whatever, and you just kind of wait, and they take forever to germinate. Most of the time that is due to a lack of heat. And so there are different ways that you can kind of help speed that process along. Because the problem with a slow germination rate means that, remember that sack lunch I said the seed had? It runs out of energy. It runs out of food while it's trying to push up through that soil. The longer it takes for it to germinate over what is normal for that seed, the more energy it is expending, which means it's going to have less energy to pop itself up through the soil and actually start to grow once it does that. And you might end up with weak seedlings. Most seeds, even the cool weather seeds, like a soil temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even our cold weather stuff. The one exception to that really is like lettuces. They will germinate in soil that is as cool as 40 degrees, and they are just as happy to do it in that as they are if it's 75. So, which is why that's what you're going to be planting this afternoon, is seed, is lettuce. But most of them like that warmer temperature. So, if you don't mind making an investment in your seed starting, this is a seedling heat mat. They come in all different sizes. This is a 10 by 20. This is what the size of a standard tray is. So these trays are all 10 by 20, 20 trays. That's the standard size for these. But you could also use them, for your little ones like this and get a bunch of them on there as well. They come in one single size. You can have double this. You've got ones that will fit 4 trays. Some of them have a control on them that will control low to high, exactly how warm this is getting. Others of them just plug in and it just warms to whatever temperature it's going to warm to. The idea is that these mats will raise the temperature of the soil 5 to 15 degrees above what your ambient air temperature is. And so that is going to speed the germination. I didn't have one of these my first couple of years, and I bought one. At the time, it was like $40 investment, and that was a lot for us. But that I'm still using that same heat mat all these years later. So if you're going to make the investment, it's not a bad one. I think this one might have been 20 bucks, I think. So, but if you're not interested in using something like this, it's not a necessity. It's kind of a nice to have. You can also just try to put your seedlings somewhere where it's naturally warmer in your house. So a lot of the time, the tops of our refrigerators tend to give off some heat up there. You can pop them up there for 3 or 4 days and let them kind of get the soil warmed up that way. You can also just water your seedlings or water your seed starting mix the very first time as you're planting your seeds with warm water. So 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so is a really good temperature to go for. At least that way the seeds are getting that initial burst of warmth, and that's going to kind of spur that process on. I do not recommend what I have seen people do, which is to use our heat mats that we use for like our aching backs. A, they tend to be way too hot. B, those are usually on timers. They'll have automatic shutoffs. So you're going to be out there turning the darn thing on and off all the time. And it just is not, they're generally not like waterproof or water resistant like these are. So if you're watering the seedlings or there's any water coming out of the bottom, you know, then that just becomes a fire hazard. So I don't recommend, I hate when I see people do that. Just don't do that, please. Find another way to do it. And if you don't have any way to warm them up, that's okay too. They are going to eventually germinate. So don't stress too much about that. These are just things that are going to kind of help that germination process along. When you do plant these, or when you start your seeds, we want to make sure that we are also keeping it damp, right? And so, especially if you're adding heat to the equation, that is going to dry things out a little bit more quickly. So that is where these little humidity domes come into play. This one came with it, great. If you're using a tray like this or even something like this, simply throwing some plastic wrap over the top to trap that moisture in will be fine. If you go the alternative route, you can use you know, the cotton handkerchiefs or whatever that are covered with beeswax. You know, that's a more sustainable alternative. You can cover anything that you can do to cover this and keep that soil moist while you're waiting for those seeds to germinate. We don't want to have to go back and really water those seedlings a whole lot because we don't want the seeds moving around too much in that soil while they're trying to germinate. So if it does dry out, then I recommend using a mist bottle, a spray bottle. That will keep the top of that damp long enough for those seeds to go ahead and sprout. Once they do sprout, if you have them on a heat mat, that's when you take them off the heat. We don't want that extended amount of heat going on because that can actually damage the roots if it's going. A lot of people are like, wait a second, hold on. You said it needs heat to germinate, but now it doesn't want heat because that's too hot. What does it do naturally out in the soil? So, naturally, when seeds are being planted out in the soil, they're just dropping off the plant at the end of the season. And then the wind kind of moves them around and they get buried just a little bit down into that soil, but it's generally only going to be 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch at the most. The top layer of that soil is going to heat up much more quickly than 3 or 4 inches down. You know, even when it's, you know, 25 degrees outside and that soil down in here might still be kind of frozen, all those 1 to 2 inch layers at the top are going to warm up much more quickly. So the seed is naturally going to get that heat. As soon as it sprouts, those roots are headed down. Well, down there further, that soil is still nice and cool. And that is going to promote, at least in your cooler seedlings, that is going to promote that growth really quickly. When you're looking at like tomatoes and peppers, the peppers don't mind, the tomatoes don't mind. So if you're still waiting for all of those things to pop up and germinate, you've only got maybe a handful of them and you're still waiting for a bunch of them to germinate, it's okay to leave them on the heat mat for a little while longer until you get closer to a 100% germination. At that point, you want to remove any cover that you have on top. Obviously, if you use plastic wrap, they're going to be pressing up against there, so you want to pull that off right away. But if you have a humidity dome or something, we want to go ahead and remove that as soon as the majority of your plants have started to pop up. If you leave that on, that is going to trap a lot of that warm air in there. And as it starts to cool down, That is how we promote fungal diseases. So after they start to sprout, you really no longer want to have that surface constantly wet. We want to allow that surface to dry out, which if you can do it, bottom watering really is the best way to go. This allows that soil at the top to dry out a little bit, so we're not promoting the biggest killer of the BB seedlings, which is damping off disease. This is a fungal disease that loves those kind of damp, cool conditions that are going to be right there at the surface, and you'll come in the next morning and all of a sudden you'll have these baby little seedlings that looked great the night before, but all of a sudden they're just completely over on their side. It looks like something clipped them off at the soil line. That is damping off disease. And it's just the fungus has just kind of rotted that part right there at the soil line where the stem is and has killed your little baby seedling off. So the way to prevent that is to keep that soil on the top dry while still watering the roots. So we want to do that from the bottom. If you can't do bottom watering, watering from the top is fine. We don't want to overwater the seedlings. We don't want them wet all the time. Part of that is the damping off, but the other part is we want those roots to learn to go down for its water. So if we're constantly keeping it wet along the top, then those roots aren't going down to seek out the water like they naturally will once we get them planted outside. So those roots are going to stay more shallow. They're going to be up towards the surface. They're not going to develop a really strong system down underneath the soil. So bottom watering accomplishes that as well. If you're top watering, you just want to make sure that the seedlings basically dry out between waterings. You know, check the bottom. Usually on these little things, you can look and see there's where the drainage holes are. You can tell if it's still wet down there just by looking. You can see the soil is a darker color than it is up here where it's dry. If they've rooted really well, you can lift them out. You can lift up the tray. If it seems like it's still kind of heavy, there's obviously a lot of moisture still down there in the bottom. If it's really light when you pick it up, yes, we need to go ahead and water. And then obviously if they've started to wilt, yeah, it's a good sign you probably ought to water too. Although, they can wilt if they're too watered also, so pay attention to that as well. The other thing that we need to worry about now, once those little guys have all sprouted up, is light. And that is why we get leggy seedlings. So, I started by putting my seedlings in a sunny front window, and I would just kind of rotate them to make sure, because they would start to lean one way, stretching towards the light, flip around, and they're going to lean back the other direction and try to get the light. Unless it is a very, very bright window, that gets probably 8 to 10 hours a day of light. No matter how you rotate them, no matter how bright that is, they're still going to try to stretch for the light because they're not getting sort of that full spectrum like they would if they were outside. Most recommendations are for you to buy a light. It's not, doesn't have to be as fancy as most of these setups make it seem like it needs to be, okay? Yes, I have, you know, shelving units that have lights under each shelf, and the seedlings are right there, and I can raise them up after they've sprouted, and I can lower them back down as they get taller because I do thousands and thousands of seedling every year. You can also just buy a little halo light or any other type of temporary light like this, or a tabletop version. If you have a sunny window that they're in, this is all you're really going to need. You know, it just pokes right down into the soil and it sits right over top of your seedlings. So if you've got this in the window, you can just pop this little guy right there. That's going to give you all the supplemental light that you need. It does not need to be a specific grow light. Grow lights are expensive. Grow lights are also really intended for plants that are going to be growing indoors beyond their seedling stage. So light comes in different colors, right? Red, orange, green, yellow, blue, whatever. The light that seeds or plants need come in the red and blue spectrum for the most part. What we want is that sort of red color. And so when you are looking for lights, and they can be fluorescent, they can be LED, they could just be regular shop lights, they can be tabletop lamps, any variety of light that you use just needs to be between 5,000 and 7,500 Kelvin, or lumens sometimes now they'll put on that. If it's 5,000 or above, then it's right in that range where vegetative growth is needed. That's that red spectrum. When we get to like the blue and the purple, that's when we're talking about flowering and fruiting stuff, and you don't really need that indoors because you're not growing these year round in your house, unless you're growing tropicals, and then that's a whole other story. But For vegetable seedlings, that's all we need. So your regular old fluorescent house lights or your LED lights, LED shop lights, all of those different things are perfectly fine as a supplemental light source. It doesn't need to be fancy. You can also get really fancy, and you can buy things that are, I mean, they've got tabletop versions that allow you to raise and lower, you know, the light. And Aero Garden, that tabletop like hydroponic things, they have one that is specific to seed starting that has like 25 little holes for you to be able to start, and that light raises and lowers, and you just let the water run or whatever. It's actually really cool. And then you just transplant those out into the garden. But you do not have to invest a ton of money into special lights or special setups or anything else. Some sort of supplemental light is going to be necessary, though, to prevent those seedlings from stretching towards the light. What's also important is how close those lights are to the seedlings when they sprout. So ideally, when they're sprouting, if you can get that light to be only about 4 inches away from the tops of those seedlings, that is mimicking this all-encompassing light that they would get outside. And as they grow, you raise the light up. Or if your light is fixed, then you just kind of stack the seedling up on books or whatever, and then gradually lower it down as it gets taller. That's actually what I do with my seeds, because I'm not raising and lowering, 20 sets of fluorescent lights all the time. I'm stacking it up higher. Leggy seedlings aren't the end of the world if they can manage to stand themselves up, especially when it comes to tomatoes. Tomatoes, when you transplant them, I will show you. I was just gifted these little baby tomato plants Friday. And these were just extras that somebody had that they were growing. And these look like they might be a little leggy. They're fine. They're perfectly fine, because when we transplant these, we're going to bury them. We're going to put that stem all the way down into the soil and just leave that top inch or two exposed, because everywhere along here, this is going to root, because tomatoes are a vine type plant. But you can't do that with all of your seedlings, because if you do that with something like, say, a broccoli or a cauliflower, where you have that amount of stem before you get to the growth, then it's likely that that stem area might rot if we were planting them this, when they were this skinny. When they get larger, that's a little bit less of a concern. A way to help strengthen your seedlings is to give them some airflow. So I always recommend having a little tabletop oscillating fan of some sort right in your seed starting area, so that as they start to pop up, you can provide them with a gentle breeze. What this does is it strengthens the seed stem, or the plant stem, and allows it to hold itself upright, because it's constantly resisting against that wind. And then I'll turn the tray around, and now it's constantly resisting this way. So just like a bodybuilder who, you get these little micro tears in your muscles when you use them like that, and that repair of that muscle is what causes it to get bigger. Same thing for the stem of a plant. The more it's moving back and forth like this, the more that it's breaking up the fibers in that stem, and that repair process is making it stronger. So even if they do become a little scrawny, a little leggy, they can hold themselves up, then they're going to be okay to be transplanted. So if they get leggy, as long as they're not falling over on their side, they're still salvageable. Once they get to the point where they're falling over on their side, then it's probably time to start some new seeds, because those are very rarely ever salvageable, unless it's something like a tomato where you can just bury it down in the soil and let it start growing again. But that's the exception to the rule. So preventing leggy seedlings involves the light, making sure the light is close enough to those seedlings, and then also giving them some wind resistance, which also, by the way, is going to help prevent that damping off disease as well, because it's going to keep the soil, the top of that soil, a little bit more dry, and it doesn't have the opportunity to be able to grow along the surface.
So do you keep the fan on all the time?
I generally put it on the same timer that I have my lights on. So while the lights are on during the day, the fan is blowing. While the lights turned off, then the fan is off. Because we also don't want them chilling too much at night. Which brings me to my final point before we get into the actual seed starting. Growing on. So when you have gotten to the point where your seeds have sprouted and you've got the lights going and you've got the fan going, the temperature requirements sometimes change for these plants. So your seed starting area generally is going to be warm, because that's what the seeds need. But depending on what it is that you're growing, you may need to move your seedling growing area to someplace different, or at least over a little bit, to where you can modify the growing conditions. If you're growing something that is a cool season crop like lettuces, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, those types of things, it actually prefers a cooler air temperature than something like tomatoes or peppers. Peppers especially hot peppers. They prefer a warmer air temperature. So that fan, especially if you have cool weather seedlings, is going to do them a really good favor, because oftentimes these lights are going to give off a little bit of heat. So that fan is going to help to cool them down. But if you have your plants and you're starting, mainly summer plants, heat-loving plants, and your seed starting area isn't particularly warm, you may have to add a little heater, a space heater. Or if you're sprouting, your early stuff, your cool weather stuff, and it's time to start those tomatoes, you may have to move those cool weather plants someplace to another corner where it's a little bit cooler, so you can keep this area warmer for your tomatoes. Again, it's nuanced based on the plants that you're starting, but it doesn't have to be difficult. It just means paying attention to what that particular plant needs. So when we get into seed starting, we think about reading the directions on the package. If it's a good seed supply company, they're likely going to give you some information about how to start that seed. If it's not listed on there, just do a quick search online, because you want to know basically what is the germination temperature that seed needs as far as its soil is concerned, and then the type of growing conditions it likes once it gets out into the garden, so you can mimic that as closely as possible as they're growing on. The other thing that we also want to know is how deep does that seed like to be planted, because just like it not being warm enough, that seed being planted too deeply into the soil is going to cause it to expend more energy as it's trying to sprout and push its way up through extra soil that it didn't really need to get through if it's a tiny little seedling, or seed like a lettuce or something like that. So it'll usually say plant an 1/8 of an inch deep or a 1/4 inch deep or whatever. This oftentimes depends on the size of the seed. Oh, which is something that I also forgot to tell you. We talked about these little containers for the smaller, plants and the shallow plants. But what about things like zucchini or pumpkins that have these very large seeds? We generally don't want to be using something this small to start something that's going to start out so big. So if it's a big seed like this, you're going to want to start it in something that is closer to like a 3.5 inch type of a pot. That's going to prevent you from having to pot that thing up multiple times before it gets a chance to go outside. And they also grow very, very quickly. So, you size your pot according to the size of your seed, essentially.
How do you know when you should pot it?
So oftentimes the plant itself is going to tell you that it's time. It either has really sort of filled the container, or the roots have filled the container, and it's might be starting to look like it's getting yellow leaves around the bottom, like it's not getting enough. It doesn't have enough soil volume to hold the amount of food basically that it needs. Oftentimes you just look at them and go, okay, you know what, that looks like it could handle being potted up if you want it to grow larger faster. Because the more soil area it has for those roots to expand, the larger the top side of the plant is going to get, or the more quickly it's going to get that large. So it's kind of eyeballing it, honestly, and just kind of, and it comes with experience. I mean, you just kind of have to try it over and over again and see. There have been times when I've gone to pot things up and I'll go to pull them out and realize, oh, you don't have enough of a root system for me to be moving you from one pot to another. Let's just tuck you back in there and give you a little bit longer to get, bigger. But you're not going to know until you pull it out and see. And that's also the indication to me at that point that I have been watering too much from the top and it hasn't developed its roots all the way down to the bottom like it's supposed to. So, but yeah, when they start to sort of fill their containers a little bit, usually you want to wait until it has multiple of its true leaves. So what we mean when I say true leaves is when these plants sprout, you're going to have two first little leaves. Those are the cotyledons. And those are essentially what has been feeding this plant in order for it to, that's its box lunch, essentially. That is what it has been using to get itself burst out of that seed coating. It's not really going to start to photosynthesize really well and produce its own food for itself until it gets those next sets of leaves. So if we look at, let's see if I can get one of these guys out of here. One of these So these leaves here, these first two leaves here, those are the cotyledons. These are the ones, they always look different from what the other mature leaves are going to look like. These are the first two true leaves of that plant. So they look very different from the cotyledons. These are the ones that start with the photosynthesis and start really feeding the plant. Once they've got these, then it's usually safe to go ahead and pot them up if you need to. Don't do it when they're just in the little baby stage like this. But again, once they kind of get filled in, then that's a really good time to make that choice. Go ahead and do that. You can see even on these tomatoes, you know, they have their couple of, you know, just a little cotyledons still. Only on this one, it's only got the one. But they've got these first two here, and these could probably easily be potted up. But again, they're tomatoes; they're going to root no matter what. Anywhere this touches is going to root. So they're less of a concern than those other plants. So let's see. We talked about watering, heat mats, lights growing on, depths of seeds, light or dark. That's our final concern. Some seeds do need light to germinate. It should say so on the packet. There are only a handful that I can think of, celery being one of them, if I remember correctly, that need light to germinate. So when we plant these seeds, we don't want to be covering that one with a bunch of soil. We also don't want to be putting anything over the top of them to trap the moisture that is not allowing light to come through. So they're few and far between. Most plants are going to do just fine being covered, but pay attention on that seed packet. If it says needs light to germinate, then all you're going to do is just kind of press the seed into the soil. So what we're going to do is I am going to show you this little compressed block here. We'll get that going. Does anybody have any questions while I'm doing this? Any other questions, I should say? We're going to let you guys go ahead and pot up your own little seeds here.
Question. When you're potting up those tomato plants that you had there,
Yep.
When you pot them up, do you bring the soil up pretty close to the top?
Yep.
And then? Okay.
Yep. I usually, when I'm transplanting these guys, I leave maybe an inch at the top out of the soil, and the rest of it all gets buried.
Okay.
Because it's gonna promote that strong root base.
That's what you do each time then?
Every time.
Okay.
Every time. It's even when you're buying. So these are really long and leggy, but the reason these are is because these are my really early ones. These are container tomatoes. These are all actually meant to stay in containers, and that's how I sell them. So I will strip off the leaves off of all of that, and I will quite literally bury this down. Let's get that guy out of there. I will pull all of this off, and I will bury them right up to there. And that's all this leaf will be gone, and this will be what is growing. And all of this will become root system. And it makes for a very, very strong plant. It also makes for an easier to start fruit production too, because it's got the ability to take in more nutrients at that point. So.
Staying on the topic of tomatoes, can I plant tomatoes in the same bed I planted them in last year if I add new soil?
I love that question. She asked whether or not you could plant tomatoes in the same spot as you did last year if you added nutrients to the soil. The short answer to that is yes, so long as you don't have any evidence of soil-borne diseases. The reason we talk so much about crop rotation is both the nutrient concern, but then also soil-borne diseases. And I understand, home gardeners, you only have so much room where you can rotate stuff, and it's all kind of sharing the same soil anyway half the time. So if you have amended your soil really well with some, good compost or rotted manure, or you're adding amendments of some sort and you didn't see any problem with soil-borne diseases the previous year, then absolutely go for it. Your plants will start to tell you if it's been too many years in a row that you've planted the same thing, or even the same something in the same family. So, if you've got anything in the nightshade family, which would be the tomatoes, your peppers, eggplant, potatoes, those all kind of use the same nutrients, and they all are susceptible to the same fungal diseases and the same soil-borne diseases. So if you start to see problems, then you don't want to plant anything in that family for about 3 years and let that soil, change out. There's a lot of things that you can do to remediate that soil. Planting sunflowers is a really good one, because sunflowers will take up a lot of the excess stuff that we don't want in the soil, and then you can just pitch, the sunflowers.
So could you plant sunflowers with the tomatoes?
You can, but you want to do them along the outer edges. Sunflowers can sometimes have an allelopathic property, which means they'll give off a chemical from their roots that is detrimental to other seedlings. So you just don't want them planted right up against the sunflowers. But if you've got a few feet away, then yeah, absolutely you can do that. And that actually helps to keep down some of the weeds too, because of that allelopathic property. The little baby seedlings of the weeds don't tend to pop up as much. Yeah, I love sunflowers for that. They're also actually being used by the EPA to remediate contaminated soil. So, but of course you have to get rid of it specially. You can't like compost it or something like that, because then you're just putting it back down again, but it has to be incinerated and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they're amazing plants. All right, we just break this up a little bit, and then we'll just pour the water in. It is going to hydrate itself to a texture that's going to allow us to use it. So it just sits for about 2 minutes. So this whole block will probably take about 2 cups of water. It's going to increase. You can buy these in much bigger blocks too. So we're just going to let that sit for a minute, absorb that. You'll see as I'm pouring, it's just starting to swell up. Those toys we used to have as kids that you would throw into the bath water and they would turn into something.
Oh,
Alright, I'll keep doing that, let it do its thing. And then I'm going to give you each a pot. I should say. For you. There we go. Kiddo, you want to do some seed planting?
You want to do it?
You want Mom to do it, and you can help her. Yeah. Okay. You want? I didn't think you did. You're just here for the show. Is that it? Okay. Entertainment.
He's my external hard drive.
All right. You can use a spoon to do this or whatever if you don't want to get your hands dirty. But I like getting my hands dirty. Okay. So when no matter what you use for your seed starting, you want to make sure that it is well hydrated before you get it into your containers. The reason for this is once you put this into your container and we get the seed in there, we don't really want to disturb the seed so much. We want it settled in and we want it just to stay put. So I actually just use a little bit too much water on this. That's what I get for not measuring this stuff out. So apparently what we don't want to do, you don't want to be able to do that. Okay? We don't want that. You should be able to squeeze something out of it. Like this. There's that. Yeah. So and this would be too dry, right? So it's not really holding together very well. And if I squeeze it really hard, I'm not getting any water. But if I get a couple of drops of water out of it, if I squeeze it that hard, that is the consistency that we want or the moisture level that we want. Now, is this bad? No, it'll be just fine. In fact, I will fill these for you so you're not getting your hands all dirty, because obviously I made this a little bit too moist. That's okay. It just means you won't have to worry about watering it.
If we do it at home and we get it too wet, could we also just like combine it with other?
Yes, you could absolutely put some more of it in there to help take up some of that that soil. Absolutely. So I'm going to fill this up about 3/4 of the way. And then we're going to press it down in there just a little bit. Have that. Thank you, bud. All right. Put that in there. And then we just sort of press it down a little bit, right? We don't want to compress it so much that it's super tight, but we do want to pat it down to where it gives us a nice little bed to put our seeds. Okay. Okay. Got it? Got it. Okay. So the easiest way to do this is just press it down, exactly. Just kind of tap it down like that a little bit. There we go. And then we're just going to put the seed gently on top, and then we're going to cover it. So we're going to use lettuce seeds. They're not going to need a whole lot in the way of covering. I figure out what I did with the seed cover. Oh, there it is. So 1/4 inch on these guys is usually good. We're not here, so this is today's apron. Thank you very much. This is Nevada. When your seed's starting, depending on how old your seeds are, you may want to plant more than one in each cell. And then you can thin them out later on if you need to. If they're brand new seeds, more than likely your germination is going to be fairly good, but I always like to hedge my bets and make sure that I've got, you know, probably 2 in each cell. That's because I need to save space. So, I mean, I want to make sure that all of my cells are germinating. It's entirely up to you whether you want to do that or not. Things that are easy to sort of thin out and pot up separately, you know, tomatoes are super easy to do. Peppers are easy to do for the most part. Most of your herbs, most of these guys here, your brassicas, are fairly easy. If you have a couple in one, you can just sort of, when they sprout, separate them and put them in 2, so you get multiple plants out of one.
When
But
they sprout or when they get their true leaves?
when they get their true leaves, when they are ready to be potted up, then you can separate them. If it's something that doesn't transplant very well in your experience, you've had a hard time getting them to move, things like squashes don't generally love to have their roots messed with when they're getting transplanted. So if I have 2 come up in one, I usually just clip one off, and that way I can take the whole mass of soil and pot it up, and that way I'm disturbing the roots a little bit less and makes them less prone to transplant shock. So take a
Do
couple of
plants
those
have an
seeds.
expiration date?
I'm sorry?
Do plants have an expiration?
Seeds?
Seeds.
Yes,
Red,
yes they do. Okay, fine. Like two-ish in each one. 3 is even fine, whatever you want to do, and just sprinkle them across the top. And then we're going to put a little bit more soil on top. There you go. Okay. Now, because we made sure that this seed starting mix was nice and wet before we put it in there, we're not going to have to worry about watering these right away. So I'm just going to take a little bit more soil and put it right on top, and I'm just going to firm it in a little bit to make sure that those seeds sort of stay in place. Okay, and at that point, this is when I want to cover them and put them on a heat net. But the reason we did lettuce seeds for you to take home is I'm going to assume you don't have a heat net. You don't have any place for them to put these. So these are going to germinate no matter what you do with them. Okay, you can put them in a sunny window and that'll get them to, you know, kind of be warmer. Or you can just put them on a counter so they're out of direct sunlight so they don't dry out super quickly. Just make sure they stay damp. If you do need to water them, again, if you have a spray bottle and a spray bottle with some warm water before they sprout would actually help move them along just a little bit. Now, when you plant your seeds, you want to be sure, oh, you already covered yours. All right, well, I'm going to leave you alone. You did good. You want to make sure that you are labeling them. You want to know what you have in each one of your little containers there. And you also want to know the date that you planted them and their expected days to germination. Because I can't tell you the number of times that I have gone down and looked at something and just gotten frustrated because why have you not sprouted yet? What is taking you so long? And then I look at the date that I planted it and it's only been 3 days. And the expected germination is 5 to 7. We get impatient when we look at the little babies, we want them to pop up, but they're not doing it. So I always put what it is, so lettuce, the variety, Nevada, the date that we're planting it, March, whatever the day is, 17th, and expected days to germination, which is 5 to 7. As far as plant labels are concerned, you don't have to buy the fancy ones. Use anything. I have cut up old yogurt containers and just used a Sharpie to write this information and to pop it in there. You can buy, you know, the ones. I don't recommend like popsicle sticks or tongue depressors because they tend to wick the moisture up from the soil. And so even if you're using a permanent marker, eventually you're not going to be able to read that as the water continues to go up. Ask me how I know. Yes. So not having hundreds of seedlings and not knowing what they are is not a fun thing. So always something that's plastic and with something that's going to be able to, you know, withstand the water if you're watering it. So that is the basics of seed starting, you know, and growing them on. Once you get to the part where you're growing them on and you need to pot them up and transplant them, we're doing another seed start or another workshop on transplanting here in a few weeks for out in the garden. But for as far as potting them up, Generally, it's going to be based on what it is. So if it's something like this that is a cool weather plant, these are just going to go straight out in the garden. I'm not going to be potting these into anything larger than what they're already in. But when we're talking about these little tomatoes, yes, these are not going to go into the garden probably until the second week in May at the earliest. I plant by soil temperature, so it might not even be that early. So these will get potted up at least one more time, and they'll go into something like this size, so we only have to do it once, and I'll continue to feed them. Same thing with things like peppers, eggplant, brassicas, they just stay in there. Things like your squashes and your zucchinis, if you're not planting them directly from seed out in the garden, which you absolutely can do here, if you are starting them indoors, I try to start them in a large enough container where I don't have to worry about potting them up, just because they don't love being transplanted. So if you only have to do it one time straight from pot into garden, you're better off. But if you have a very small seed starting area and you need to start them in smaller containers, then just choose the biggest one that you possibly can, and it's going to tell you when it's time for it to move, because it's going to take up that container fairly quickly, and it's going to be like, okay, time to pot it into something else. So, anybody have any other questions? Good, fantastic. Okay, I hope you got what you needed out of this. I know it's a lot of information to take in. Because of that, I wrote an ebook, and I will email you all the link so that you have something that you can reference back to. And it's all about seed starting and the distance for your lights and your heat mats and everything else, so that you don't have to take everything that I just threw at you and try to remember it. So if you have any questions at all, you're more than I'm happy to answer any questions by email. If you want to respond to that email when I send it to you, I will answer questions all day long.
Interesting about the light. I didn't realize you didn't have to have a grow light.
Yes. Yep. No. As long as it's 5,000 Kelvin or above, between 5,000 and 7,500 is the ideal for vegetative growth, which is what we're going for. And that's basically your general, regular fluorescent light, a daylight bulb is really what you're looking for. A daylight bulb.
The lights that I have are blue and red.
That's fine. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. It just means that the plants are using the red light for their vegetative growth, and when they get ready to flower, they're using more of that blue spectrum. And so, but they'll use both. That's a full spectrum bulb, and that's perfectly fine too. Yeah, absolutely. There you go. Well, thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate you being here. And like I said, any questions, let me know.